maybe want to learn a little bit more about it. I've got a great panel up here today. You guys probably know me, Captain Todd Manser. I was with Boardroom Fishing for years. I'm a commercial sword fishing for years. I own a fish market. I own Manser Marine. But I have not been out nighttime jig fishing for these bluefin because I got too much other stuff, so I'm gonna have these guys tell you how to do it. I've caught a lot of grouper on my jigs. I've caught a lot of yellows, a lot of other things, but they'll probably talk a little bit about different aspects of jigging, slow pitch, fast jigging, stuff like that. I'm gonna first start by introducing everybody, and guys, I hope I get it right. On stage here, we've got James Kikwa. Did I say it right? Got it right? Brian Newen. Yep, got that right. Benny Ortez right here, and George Polo. And the way this works here, guys, did I say it right? Yeah. So the way this works, I've got some scripted questions that are basically generic to what everybody's questions would be, and I'm going to leave it up to them to kind of get to these questions and give you as much information out of it as possible. And at the end, we'll open up for some questions. So, without any further ado, you've got your Cutwater cocktail ready, and it's time to get started. So let's start off with talking about tackle setups for slow pitch, and then we'll start talking about speed jigging. I noticed that and we were talking about John Bretza, jigging rods can be a little bit different in some aspects for slow pitch versus some other types of jigging rods. Let's just talk about, we'll start over here with James. James, what are your jigging rods, your outfits? Talk a little bit about the tackle that you're using and what you prefer.
So the setups that I like to use are rods like the Phoenix Megalodon paired up with the Jigging Master reel, usually rated anywhere from PE 3.6 to PE 610. Those are PE 3.6 being the lightest jigging setup that we use for bluefin, yellowtail, and then the PE 610 are for the big stuff, the big bluefin. Well, we'll pair that up with a Jigging Master PE 8 reel, which has a lot of drag, and those are two setups that we generally use for jigging the bluefin.
And then, so Brian, talk a little bit about the spiral wrap and I mean when some of us look at some of these jigging rods, we look at them and go, there's no way. I mean, they're so parabolic for the most part, but it's all about action, right? So what are your rods? And talk a little bit about that rod, because you were actually at Akuma for a while. You probably were there in some of the innovative stages of the jigging rod. Talk a little bit about the rod and then the reel to pair it up with.
Sorry about that. I think I want to go back to your first question there, Todd, real quick, is the separation between the two. I'm here at a booth and people are coming in and asking about slow pitch rods for bluefin. And they're a little different. We wouldn't categorize necessarily the rods that James was talking about as slow pitch rods. They are a jigging rod for sure, but you can look at inside of George's booth, he's got what we would know as slow pitch rods in there. But as far as the spiral wrap versus a straight wrap, that seems to be a question that a lot of people have. Most of my rods are built as a spiral, but having said that, I have fished rods that are built with just standard wrap rods or guides. And what I have found that is the difference in rod twist. We talk about rod twisting and how the spiral wrap works. If you're familiar with it, and the thought process behind it is that when you go to pull on the rod and put a big bend in the rod's not going to twist in your hands as much, so you'll have a little bit more control over it. But the way that, a lot of times how we fight these fish, I do workshops about how to fight them on the jigging rods, but the way that we fight them, that doesn't come into play as much as the one benefit that it does have, which is to minimize the chances of what we call tip wrap. And what that means is that if you haven't got the cadence proper and you've got too much slack in your line, the line tends to want to jump up and wrap around your tip. So a couple things can happen when you have tip wrap. Number one, you hope that you don't get bit with about 25, 30 pounds of drag, because whatever it wraps up against, it's going to take it into the ocean with it. That includes your guides. More importantly, with that being said, if it does catch on the rod guides, one thing that we have found is that if you have to stop while the jig is sinking and unwrap it, there's chances of you, when you hit that pause button real quick, even for that couple of seconds to do that, your line starts to scope out. So that's where we have found, some the advantages of having the spiral wrap on our rods and what we do for the bluefin fishing anyway.
You want it? Yeah, go ahead and
jump in.
Yeah,
quick.
jump in, please.
So I think it's very important. I mean, we obviously, I've done most of my fishing. I'm from Spain, so I've done most of my fishing in Europe and the East Coast. I don't have so much experience in the East Coast, but talking with the guys, seeing the videos, seeing the photos, I think there is a 50-50 market here. And I think there's two approaches to the jigging thing. So one of them are going to be like a sport fishing boats, big boats, 30 guys on a boat. And then the other approach is private boat, right? And the reason why I want to talk about that is because that's going to determine a lot the gear that we're using, right? A lot of what we see is, especially on the bigger boats, you kind of have to go a little bit with what the guy next to you is doing in terms of like line diameter, the way you fight the fish. You are almost in a rush, right? It almost looks like you hook that fish, you have limited time, you gotta get that fish out of the water. One, because the guy next to you is hooked up, or 3 guys next to you are hooked up, you're not gonna get tip wrap. And second, because the boat has another 30 people on board, they're ready to hook another fish, they wanna move. So that right there is already kind of like limiting you to whatever tackle you're using, right? As if you have a private boat, you can do a little bit of everything, right? So you can use thicker line if you want to, you can use thinner line if you want to, so you can get away with a lot more things. So I think it's very important based on what we see, and thankfully, like, I'm in contact with a lot of different anglers all around the world doing jigging, specifically jigging. That's like the particular thing about California, right? You guys have a great fishery, and more than just that, you have a great access to the fishery with those sport boats. So that's where, we should focus on like the 2 different approaches, and I'm sure here at the public there'll be a lot of people down private boats and they go on the sport boats as well.
Yeah, it's definitely, I wouldn't say it's 50-50, but it's definitely a great mix of sport boat, and even a lot of private boaters end up on, overnight or multi-day overnight boats because they get a better platform for that nighttime jigging. So that's great information, because I never thought of that, and it's true. You really want to be paired up with what is happening next to you so that you can kind of control the situation a little bit, or vice versa, and not have to worry about them not being able to control their situation. So talk a little bit about reels, 2 speeds, high speed. What is the jigging preference reel? Let's start off. We could talk either slow pitch or for just jigging. So go ahead.
All right. So for me, when I look at jigging reels in general, I'm looking for something that's going to have about 38 to 46 inches per crank, in that kind of wheelhouse there. So any type of reel that does that or is capable of doing that is going to be capable to do your slow pitch actions. The reason why you want to have that area, kind of that wheelhouse, if you will, of inches per crank, it's just you want to be consistent at depth. Okay, so at the further that you go down, depending on where you're marking those fish at night, I would also suggest using metered braid so that you know exactly where that line is in the water, exactly how much you have out. In terms of the type of reel, you generally use a narrow spool reel that helps with your line lay on there, so you don't have to worry during the fight or when you're actually jigging that you're going to get stacked up on either side. Now, in terms of 2-speed, that's really personal preference. It really depends on the size of the fish that you're targeting. If you're targeting a 200-pound tuna and you really feel that you need that extra torque, then yeah, 2-speed might make sense. For me personally, I generally just use a lower gear ratio to have that higher torque, especially if you're fishing for tuna, because the speed that you're fishing for them in terms of the actual jigging tends to be a little bit faster, and counterintuitively having a lower gear ratio allows you to move that jig through the water with less effort. The higher the gear ratio, the more taxing it is on you while you're moving the jig through the water.
Sure. Before we move on to the next topic, let's talk a little bit about mono and floral. Is it pretty much standard that you're going to use floral leaders, or are you using monofilament? I mean, obviously jigging's more braid line, main line. But then are you using any mono top shot, or are you using any floral?
Sure. So I only use fluorocarbon as my top shot, if you will. I generally use a fairly short leader, usually only about 12 feet or so. But I prefer fluorocarbon because it's a bit harder, and the knots that we tie for those slim line-to-line connections, particularly with slow pitch, and you can see George's rods over there, how small those guides are. We use a PR knot or an FG knot, and they pass through the guides really seamlessly. But that fluoro, when you're tying those types of knots, it helps bite in because that line is a little bit harder. What I find personally is that monofilament is a little too soft. And when you're tying those high tension knots, it tends to bite in a little bit too much and bubble. And I don't know if the guys have any other ideas on that.
Well, I think one of the points as well between fluoro and mono, like obviously mono is a little bit more stretchy, more bouncy. So the reason why we use braided line, and I think it's important for the guys that just never done it before, we do want to have braided line on our reels. The main reason because of that is we don't want any stretch. So braided line is going to stretch only 1.5 to 3% versus mono line or any kind of like nylon. You're going to have 20-30% stretch. So when you're trying to move a jig 200-300 feet from you, if not further, it's a big deal. You do a little bit of math. 200 feet, 20% of 200 feet is 60 feet. That is, it's given. So braided line is important, and then everybody, I think, for the most part, uses fluoro. How about you guys?
For the speed jigging, I usually use mono, and I use about 20 feet of mono. So for speed jigging, it's a high impact. If you hook them on the pump, you just want to give it a little bit of shock absorbing. Yeah, so that's what I generally use.
Right, and Brian, I mean, when you look at the rods are designed to also absorb some of the shock of fishing in the no stretch, braid situation, right? So that's why when we're looking at some of our jigging rods, they're developed for a couple of things, but one of the things is to pick up some of the shock so you don't have you're not ripping hooks out. So you can still jig, you can still work properly. Correct me if I'm wrong. A jig, but then the rod picks up or has the absorbency to allow the hook set. Is that fairly accurate?
There's a little bit of a, obviously you're hearing some differences here in that you would think that when we go out, we fish a lot of fluoro ourselves, but as James said, we use an awful lot of monofilament. In fact, it's all we use out there. There's a couple of reasons for that, is because number one, we use specific monofilaments as well. We're looking for stuff that has low memory as well as thinner in diameter for sure. That's something that you can wind onto the smaller arbor of the spools of the size of the reels that we have. But with monofilament, what we have found is that the shock absorption, in particular, towards that end game, there's a couple of things. We have all kinds of different obstacles when we're on a boat. I like to say they're either man-made, boat-made, or all of the above. And a little bit of that shock absorption, for one, it certainly does feel better when you are in that end game and fighting them. And then, of course, with having that bit of stretch in there, it certainly does help in us keeping the hooks buried into that fish. And certainly the rods do help in that category for sure. But our approach for us and what we do, we don't need necessarily that. We don't place that much of an emphasis on the lower stretch, because I think that 100-pounder freight training your jig, it takes out a lot of stretch right then and there, right from the bite. But we place that premium a little bit more on the fight as well as on the end game. So for us, the monofilament works out a little bit better.
Gotcha. And then just off topic here, we're mainly talking about conventional reels. We haven't really talked about jigging with a spinning reel for smaller fish. I know a lot of us right now are gearing up for hopefully another year of seeing 100 to 200 pound bluefin, which on a spinning reel I've done. It's fun, popper fish and stuff like that. You guys ever fish spinning reels for jigging? Is that something that I love spinning reels? I hated them when I was a kid. but now I just absolutely love them. They've come such a long ways that they're a lot of fun. And is there any different setup for fishing a spinning reel for jigging than there is a conventional reel?
So typically speaking, we do make some spinning rods, and you do see people getting into it. It's not the ideal thing because it's a comfort thing, but like I personally start jigging with spinning reels just is because by default it's the easiest way to do it. Everybody owns spinning reel. In fact, like if you look back in the industry 10, 15 years ago, lots of the speed jigging was done with spinning reels, short rods, 4.5, 5 rods, those like Cape Cod rods were everywhere. And it was mostly done with spinning. I think as the jigging industry evolved, we started realizing that conventional was more comfortable, it made more sense. The way the rods are wrapped now, I mean, the whole thing. When you are using a conventional, the rod becomes an extension of your arm. When you are using the spinning, it's kind of like the reel handle is kind of below. Is it possible? Absolutely. It's kind of like a personal preference, but I think that the tendency, the trend is to go more conventional.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and also for slow pitch jigging in particular, the rod is really just the tool to impart an action on the jig. It's not to fight the fish. So the way that you gain line with the spinning gear is to pull and lift and pump. That style doesn't really lend itself to a spinning setup. So for us, a conventional reel, using that as a winch, kind of pointing at the fish and just cranking evenly, tends to work out better just for the equipment itself.
Excellent answer. So that makes a lot of sense. How do your jig styles differ, and what situations would each style of jig be useful when like targeting tuna? And we can start with James.
So some of the jigs that we like to use when there's not much current is a jig that's gonna have a little bit more flutter movement to it. So it's gonna be either a wider profile jig or something flat. That's gonna create the flutter as it's sinking out. And then if they're a bit deeper and there's a bit more current, you could size up to maybe a 300 to 400 gram size jig. Generally, when we're fishing that size of a jig, we're fishing nighttime bluefin. But during the daytime, you can actually create the movement on the jig and trigger the fish to react. And bluefin during the day, it's pretty fun hooking them.
And then Brian, talk a little bit about hook size, style, assist hooks. I mean, I've seen some jigs, guys that have just, literally turned them into like grappling hooks. It's basically just how many can you put on there so that nothing's coming off. But talk a little bit about what standard, hooks style, and how that all works for setting up a.
I think we approach it very differently daytime versus nighttime on how we rig our jigs with the hooks. Our end goal is to try to have as many hooks as possible in that fish. I believe that the Japanese call it, if the fish takes in all hooks, both top and bottom, they say that it's hugging the fish. And you don't tend to lose that many of them because we do run into several factors or several obstacles again when we're on a sport boat and doing what we do. I say in my seminars, I always ask the question, I said, how many people have ever been in a two-fish tangle? Everybody raises their hand. But then again, I ask how many people have caused two-fish tangles and nobody raises their hand, so there you go. But with that, when we're in a tangle, what I have found is that if you're in a slack line or a standstill situation, by having more hooks on it, in particular for us and what we do with the bluefin, having twin hooks inside of that fish, on the bottom of that jig, we find that in that standstill, when you're waiting for a crewman or you yourself are actively trying to get out of that tangle, it does keep the fish on a little bit better. Now, having said that, we do have to make these in-game adjustments. I know that it sounds kind of odd, but I noticed something in 2022 on some trips, and depending on the mood of that bluefin, if those of that are fishing for them, they always hear the story of bluefin being bluefin. But I have had in 2022, and I think I told James about this, where the twin hooks and a single hook on the bottom, which is one of our favorite ways to do it anyway. It's one of our favorite ways. I had to pull off the twin hooks on the bottom and go with a single and single on top. You would think that the change out of one hook then wouldn't that make that much of a difference. But as far as jig cadence and its sink rate and things like that, they really do pay close attention to it. So we will do, a lot of the sport boats, some of the sport boats out here right now, they do require that you fish at night with just hooks on the bottom. So in that case, then we're gonna fish a twin hook setup, but there's all kinds of different ways. We use a lot of what these guys do as well, single hooks on top when required, especially in that daytime when they're keying in more so on this. It's not necessarily as much of a reaction, but they're really getting a good look at it.
I just want to circle back a little bit. I mean, those are great points. I want to circle back to the jig selection, which I think is one of the main categories in jigging. Because at the end of the day, the rod is important, the reel is important, the line is important, but the lure is the most important because that's what the fish is committing to, right? So that's the first step of the process. And there is a lot of jigs out there. There is a lot of different opinions or whatnot. But for the guys just starting and for the guys thinking about, just getting ready for the season, there's three main things you want to consider when you're doing your jig selection. So the number one thing is going to be your shape, right? So shape is determined by the water conditions. So how fast that boat is moving. And that, there's different variants. It could be current, it could be wind related, it could be water temp related, but how fast that boat is moving is gonna determine if you're gonna go for a skinnier, longer shape or a wider shape. So a skinnier, longer shape is gonna get you down faster. It's also a lot easier to fish because it has a lot less resistance. So you do have two pluses in there. And typically speaking, again, generally speaking, a wider shape is gonna get you down slower, but it's gonna create more action, it's gonna catch more water. So that will be number one, right? How fast that boat is moving. Number two is the depth, right? How deep am I fishing? Am I targeting bottom fish or tuna, regardless, right? If I'm on one of the big boats, the captain starts saying, hey, the tunas are 300 feet below, so I know I'm 300 feet of water. Typically speaking, you wanna do 1 gram per foot, and then that's kind of like your baseline, and from there you're gonna adjust. Lots of people, especially people trying the deep water stuff, if I'm fishing 1,000 feet of water, do I need a 1,000 gram jig? Probably not. So that rule only applies up to like, 300-400 feet. After that, we cannot stay in that 500-600 gram max. So again, circling back, things that you need to remember when you make your jig selection. Number one, how fast am I moving? Number two, how deep am I fishing? So if those fish are 200 feet of water, I want to get a jig around 200 grams. Typically speaking, that's the safe zone. And number three, in my opinion, and I think most of the guys here are going to agree as well, the least important is color. Especially your nighttime fishing, it's pretty dark down there during the day, but at night it's even darker. So I don't know how much these fish are looking at the color. And then daytime fishing, it is true that over the years, every one of us probably had different personal preferences. I do like solid colors for bottom fish. I tend to do better. I think the silhouette stands out better. But again, guys, if you are looking to purchase jigs, getting ready for the season, or you already have jigs, don't know what to bring on a trip, those three things: how fast am I moving, determine the shape; how deep am I fishing, is going to determine the size of the jig, grams, the ounces; and number three is your confidence. What color am I using?
Excellent information, because we don't think about that. If we got downhill current and wind out of the northwest here in Southern California, boat could be moving 2 knots. So that's gonna make a difference in the shape of the lure. So now you want to have the right shape so that you can get that lure swimming right, and then depending on the depth, you're gonna go with a different gram weight. That's all really good information. You want to add that?
I want to just touch on the hooks for slow pitch jigging in general. So there's 2 primary ways that you're going to rig a slow pitch jig. So it's either going to be twin hooks on top and on the bottom, or a larger single hook on the top and on the bottom. And the reason why is because when you mimic that wounded or what dying bait fish and it's kind of fluttering in the water, the fish doesn't realize that it's not a fish, but fish generally eat from the head first. So when they attack from one side of the jig, if it's backsliding, you want to have that hook on the bottom, or if the fish is attacking from the front, it'll want that hook on the front of the jig. The difference between having twin hooks versus single hooks is really the size of the fish that you're targeting. The larger fish that I'm targeting, I tend to size up my hooks. I use a tuna blade style hook. I like I don't like a wide gap in my hook. I like a shorter gap in my hook that actually the point goes back towards the shank quite a bit. I find you get a better hook set in the mouth of the fish and not a hook set in the nose or somewhere else in the face. So it's much easier to get that fish back. If you foul hook a tuna, you're in it for a bad time. So having that one single hook and larger fish, I think that works out a little bit better.
Excellent. So, and you guys can just jump in on this one. So, daytime jigging versus nighttime jigging for you guys. What seems to be, your favorite, or what's the best? I mean, obviously, I've seen a lot of situations like where we've had schools come through. I've personally had schools where literally boat lengths and boat lengths and boat lengths of fish that that aren't on the surface, that are hanging down, 180 feet, maybe 200 feet, daytime. We're chunking, we're chumming, we're doing everything we can, trying to get these fish to bite. Do you guys like that situation during the day, or do you prefer seeing that same scenario, and do you get more reaction bites at night? And you guys can answer that however you want, and kind of take that question wherever you want to go. Yeah, you can go ahead, James. Day or night, what's your favorite?
My favorite is the day, because I've had, in my experiences, I've had a lot of days where, the bite's really tough on bait and no one's getting bit. And we're the one, my brother and I are the ones that are working jigs, getting bit consistently. And that's just, and then you'll notice, like, you'll be out fishing people from like 7 fish to 1, 8 fish to 1. There's been days where we've got 9, 10 fish on a full day trip on the San Diego, and it's because the fish are reacting to the jig, and it's just a fun way also to fish. I personally don't fish bait, or I try not to fish bait, but yeah. I just love fishing jigs, and jigging is a very productive way to get fish to bite.
I'm kind of down. That daytime fish is very challenging, and if when you separate the two, I think really, I've said this in the seminars I've done in the past, I have more daytime jigs on my box than I do nighttime. Nighttime, you can kind of narrow it down to a handful of skews inside of your box, but the daytime, we fish them differently. We fish them on the slide. For the most part, like James and I, we don't, our sinker rigs that guys commonly use in the daytime, we've replaced that with the jigging rods as well. So daytime, they're really challenging. They pay more attention to the action, the manufacturer's intent, or at least what they put on the box, as far as what it does. And you don't get a lot of bites, but then sometimes you can do no wrong, and you end up with 9 or 10 on a full day trip, and away you go. But it's definitely a lot more challenging, and you really have to put on your jigging cap and start working on different cadences and finding the right jig for the right the right sink rate, the right flutter, the right timing. Daytime fishing is all about timing, right? If you're fishing the slide, you've got to time it pretty darn good. If you're going to make a cast up on the bow and rely on that thing to be kind of not necessarily scoped out all the way, but somewhat closer to the boat once it stops, so you can work that thing through and be able to stay in that zone with that fish. So,
right. So I know that James said he doesn't fish bait much, but he does fish on sport boats. So I mean, there's a big difference when we have sport boat fish, where especially if a boat's sitting and have fish under the boat, because the amount of bait that they carry to chum and keep that fish around the boat, versus the private boater that's got a scoop of bait and not really able to keep that bait on the boat or keep that fish under the boat. So in that aspect, can any of you guys answer, when do you switch from bait to jigs when you're on a private boat and you're trying to convert fish? You're seeing a little, you can't really, there's times where we slide on these schools that won't bite and they don't stay under the boat long. And you can get a drop back, you can get a bait on them real quick, or you get a popper, or you get surface iron. But when do you look at that situation and say, you know, this fish is right here. I see it on the meter consistently. I'm gonna start jigging, and you're not on the situation where you're on the San Diego or a sport boat that literally is just, you know, shoveling bait over the side and keep that fish out of the boat.
So I think jig fishing and bait fishing are totally compatible. I believe that, and in fact, like some of the, you know, long-range trips or sport fishing trips that we do back at home, we do have people fishing bait sometimes. That helps. So when you're on a boat and you are fishing with another, you know, 25, 30 anglers, the boat should fish as a team, because the boat's goal is to catch fish. So the jiggers, and this is some of the strategies we do, so if you're marking fish and you're not getting hooked up, you talk with your partner next to you, you say, okay, I'm trying this jig, you try this jig, he tries another jig, he tries another jig. Whoever gets the first bite, that's what they key in on. So you have 20, 30 people on the rail, and they're all using jigs, and everybody's using a different jig. Typically, it's gonna be easier for you to know what they're keen on. And when do you know to switch or not? I mean, that's, you know, it's kind of tough. So you'll have the guys that do bait fishing and jigging. What I've seen in a lot of the big boats is the bait guys will switch to jigs when the jig guys are killing it, right? And it's like, oh, you know, what are you doing with that tiny rod with tiny jig? And you see a lot of that. Again, I think it's beneficial. I think it's great to have bait on the water as well, especially you're tuna fishing, to get those fish fired up. There's so many variables. I mean, you get out there, the conditions change every day. The bait that they're eating change every day. The size of the fish. I mean, these are the same fish, but they are behaving completely different just because they are 50 pounds apart. You know, a 50-pound fish is eating something, and a 100-pound fish is another thing. That is the challenge of jigging, you know. And I think another point here that is important is, like, obviously we're doing, you know, we're doing a bit more of the slow jigging part, but slow jigging and speed jigging are not two different things. It's all jigging, right? We're just taking two different approaches. Yes, if you are fishing on the bigger boats, as we said, like, you have more people around you, you want to use heavier gear to get that fish on the boat, 100%. You do see lots and lots of people, you know, getting tired during the day. You know, you can rip it, you can fast jig it, but you can fast jig it on a slow pitch jigging rod. You know, you can oversize that rod. So again, it is the same thing. It's just different approaches. You can rip a jig on a little rod. You can catch a big fish on a little rod. Yes, you just have you need to work with whatever is around you. You know, so that is very important to say. Like, you know, and you gotta remember, like, backing up a little bit, like, history-wise. So slow jigging is a relatively new thing, but it comes from jigging, right? So slow jigging comes to fix a problem that during the years was, like, the heavy gear, the thing, like, I'm only gonna do it for 2-3 minutes, or, you know, 2-3 hours. I mean, you can speed jig for 3 hours, you're a rock star, right? On the heavy rods. I mean, these rods, I mean, how heavy are your setups? Like 10, 15 pounds, I mean, 10 pounds, you know, setup, which is fine. You have to have those setups if you're fishing with guys next to you that are using 50, 60 pound braid. You need that, right? But slow jigging comes as a variation, as an evolution of jigging. And that's where the Japanese, you know, really thought about this. Like, how can we do these for longer period of times? How can we target the stuff in the column, but also the stuff on the bottom? You know, when we're slow pitch jigging, we're catching tuna. If we want to target tuna, we will catch the tuna. It's just, like, a little bit more technical, and it's just not necessarily adapts 100% with the so-called style of fishing because of the guys that you're fishing next to. Now, you're in a private boat. Whoever has a private boat or has an opportunity to go out there, like, you can get away with a lot lighter tackle, and that's related as well with the number of bites you're gonna have. And this happens in every single industry, right? If you're bass fishing, or you are inshore fishing, or you're trolling, if you can fish thinner, if you can fish lighter, you typically are gonna get more bites. So those are important points, like, for the people just getting into it. There is a lot of confusion, like, oh, these are two separate things. They are, but they're not. They're coming from the same. They're jigging. You know, one is slower, one is faster. Just because it's slower, it doesn't mean our cadence can be fast, you know? So there's a lot in there, you know?
Do you see any situations where you go to lighter line when you have more, when the boat's moving more? so it cuts through the water so you can stay more vertical. And I mean, you talked about changing the shape of the lure and the weight of the lure. Do you ever size down on the size of the braid? Because braid, you know, and some braid is very buoyant, so it can create belly. It can change the way the lure sinks, especially when the boat's moving. So do you ever like grab the lighter line, go to the smaller?
Yeah, oftentimes, particularly with slow pitch jigging, we use much lighter line, significantly lighter line. In the beginning, James was talking about PE line and how his rods were rated. He was saying, you know, what is it, 3 through 6 and then 6 to 10. So when the PE scale stands for polyethylene, and that's measuring the line diameter. So if a PE3 is roughly 30 pound, PE6 roughly 60 pound or so, up to PE10, which is around 100 pound line. For us, the way that I think about it for slow pitch jigging is, I think about this line all the way down on the water and how far away I am. So let's say I'm fishing in 300 feet of water. If I'm using a line that's a 100 pound line versus a 40 pound line for that, I'm downsizing by, what, 60% the diameter. So if you took that long string of line that's in the water and you wove that into a square, and see how fast that would move in the water like a little sail, and you shrink that down, the smaller profile that is, the better you're going to stay up and down on those fish, particularly if you're marking those fish directly underneath you. You also have to factor in the breaking strength of these lines, okay? Braid breaks from abrasion.
Nothing's going to break me off because it's not abrasion. I'm only using 10 or 12 pounds of drag, and that's like locking it up. So basically on most of my setups, I'm 25% of my drag pressure, or my breaking strength. So, it's not like I'm gonna break 15-pound braid fishing rockfish unless I get something that abrases the braid. It's adjusting things with the leader that are keeping me safe and allowing me to fish more vertical, because that line's going to cut through that water.
If I could just add on what you just said, and you guys can follow up. In terms of fishing in that deeper water with that very light braid that's on there, one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that as your spool goes down with your line, your effective drag is going to increase. So what you set your drag on at the top isn't what the drag setting is going to be where the fish are. So you have to keep that in mind. If you do decide to scale down, back your drag down just a little bit, because when that fish does take the lure, you're going to be under more drag pressure than what you have at the surface.
That's excellent information. This is a great seminar. I'm enjoying this. So is there any depth that's out of range for actually vertical jigging for tuna? Is there any time where it's like they're just too deep, or is it just always go for it?
It's just always go for it.
It's always go for it. Yeah. You're just adjusting the weight, right? You just adjust the lure. So I mean, that's the nice thing about jigging. I don't do a lot of it, and I don't work on sport boats anymore. I've worked on sport boats most of my life, starting from 1978. But the fact is for a lot of guys, when they're learning how to jig, we would just tell them that when it stops your bit, if it stops your bit, you're never going to go too deep. We're in such deep water right now. If your jig stops, you have a bite. So, all right. So let's talk a little bit about. We talked about jig styles a little bit. I guess we kind of covered that. You guys are really good at covering all these different things. Between the four of you guys all have a little bit different technique. What I want to do is I want to let the audience here ask you guys some questions and see if there's anything that you didn't touch on that they've been waiting for you to say, and then we can get those topics and get you guys back to your booths, get you selling some products. So guys, I'm going to open up for questions, and guys, be as loud as you can, or actually walk right up here so we can tell. Yes.
My question is, talk about jigging, smart spots, slow pitch jigging. Any recommendations for size, rods?
So for slow pitch rockfish with spiral rods, is there any size preference, or is there any rod preference?
Okay, are you fishing from your own boat, or you're in a sport boat? All right, so you typically want to have something a little longer, 7 foot. It's gonna help you move around better. Typically speaking, the shorter rods are typically easier to move. It helps you, it's less leverage when you have a shorter rod. But I would get something around 6 foot, 6, 8, 7, something like that. Longer, you want a softer tip. You want to find a slow, this is, I go on here.
Yeah, I was gonna say that looks pretty darn close right there.
This is one of our models. So this is 710, it's 2-piece. This is designed for the, the bigger boats, taller rails. You can get around, you get away with it. Typically speaking, like I would not use this in any other situation. My tendency is to use shorter rods. Some of my really deep water rods are 5 foot, and you're like, it's crazy. But the shorter the rod, the easier it is to move that jig. So as I increase in depth and weight, I want to go shorter. So to answer your question, see if this helps. So the shallower you fish, you can get away with a longer rod, right? Less resistance. And the deeper you go, you're gonna have a tendency to go with a shorter rod. Now, if you're fishing on a big boat with a tall rail, you want to get something over 7 foot. That's what I would do. It's gonna be more comfortable for you. If you get tangled, you can get around people. And Benny probably can touch on that as well, but that's what I would do.
Yeah, if you're looking for something, just what George was saying, just the physics of it really. If you think about, if you're using this rod as a lever, think of it as a lever, right? If the further away that weight is from you, the more taxing it's going to be on the angler. Think of it if you had a 10-pound weight. You pick that weight up right at your side, it's easy to pick up. Now you hold that 10-pound weight out here, it gets a whole lot heavier, right? So that's why in the deeper water, generally a shorter rod is better, whereas you also have to factor that in what type of boat you're fishing, just like George said.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
And I'm gonna use a jig. When I see it, do you go up and down, or you just leave it like a light bait?
So if you see fish at 300 feet, do you just drop it down 300 feet and just start jigging up and down? Yo-yo it kind of, or what is the technique? I think he's asking, are you dropping down through the fish?
All right, so when I see suspended fish, what I want to do is drop the jig, and this goes back to just the general principle of jigging. I'm looking for efficiency, right? I don't want to waste time. I don't want to waste anything that's going on if I want to target that fish. The first thing that you want to do is keep your thumb on the spool to keep that a little bit of pressure on that line. That's going to keep your jig in a vertical position. It's going to shoot down to the fish in the strike zone better and faster. All right, so you're going to stay vertical in the water better. I like to go past the fish just a little bit, and that's why metered line I think is important for suspended fish that are out here, and then bring the jig through that water column, always counting my cranks, right? One full crank is roughly 3 feet, so if I go one crank, I know exactly how far I brought that up. If I drop my jig, let's say I'm marking at 200 feet, I drop it to 220, I come up to, all the way up to maybe 180, you want to be in that area where the fish are. Right?
So typically speaking as well, depends what. So typically speaking, there's 2 ways to approach it. So if you are looking for more of that reaction bite, you're gonna get more bites on the fall, the flat iron jig, right? Those fish are like less active. They usually gonna hit it for something, something that moves slower. Again, like if they're not active, they're lazy, they keep looking at each other, it's like, oh, that's an easy prey, I'm gonna get it. Now, if they're fired up, they're gonna hit it in every single way. So you can rip it up, you're gonna get bites on the rise, you can just let it drop down, they're gonna hit on the fall. That's why you see the nighttime fishing getting so popular. I mean, these fish are almost eating anything. I mean, there's like tuna bombs, and there's all these stuff. It's just like, how is it possible? Well, it's very simple. They see the vibration, it comes down, there is 100 of them, they're aggressive, they're fighting each other. The first one that gets down, hit the fish. So there's different approaches. If you do daytime, usually daytime fishing is gonna be more finicky. You wanna use better presentation, the smaller jigs. They did a great explanation of how, it's a lot more difficult daytime, it's a lot more challenging, but for the guys that are into it, feels better when you hook it on the daytime, I think, right? At least in our world. So night fishing, you can get away with a lot more. Daytime, you kind of work that jig, let it flatter, rip it. You want to try stuff, you want to change stuff. If the captain is telling you, hey, we're still marking, but you try 5-10 minutes, change the jig, try another thing. I guarantee you. And that's why there's so many jigs out there. Every jig is for a different situation, right? And the trick here, the difference between a jig fisherman or a really good jig fisherman is a jig fisherman will catch fish, the fish are fired up. But a good jig fisherman will catch fish always. Because we go a little crazy, we just keep changing the stuff, and And that's why we change this stuff, because they're not hitting it. And it's very important. I tell everybody, you know, you come and buy jigs. Don't buy 10 of the same jig, but buy a variety, see what works, right? Build, you know, write your own book. You're gonna see stuff that works better for you with your style of fishing and other people, but like, get different stuff. And once you figure it out, once you start being successful, then buy more of those, you know, because it's very important to change. It's key, you know, to get consistency.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Could you talk about the importance of using a barrel swivel versus like a chain knot to the jig?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
What was the question again?
I know some techniques are to use a swivel
Some techniques are you use a swivel
at the jig,
at the lure.
and some people use a chain knot.
I think for us, what we do, we have found a lot of success using, instead of a swivel connected to the split ring to the jig, we ourselves are using a welded ring. And what we have found is that I heard a great explanation yesterday. So a gentleman came to the booth that I was in and used a really good word. I think that when we use the swivels, for us, if we're fishing with a jig that has a lot more flutter to it, then the swivels seem to be okay. But what we have found is that on the vertical jigs, like I fish a lot of his jigs, on those types of jigs, the swivel almost accentuates it a little bit too much. And so what we have found is that a welded ring, the ones that we use anyway, connected to the split ring, you know, you do have the assist hooks, and I like to call that, you know, because of the fact that it is on that cord, I call it nature's swivel already, because it does allow that thing to kind of to move around and kind of act as a swivel, so that you don't pull a lot of the hooks on that fish. But for us and what we have found to be effective, we are actually we lean more towards a solid ring or a welded ring right to the split ring. It just seems to be able. It gives us it gives it a better look. It's not spinning on its way down and looking kind of odd when you kind of work it mechanically on the pump. So that's what James and I do.
You'll weld the actual ring to the split ring?
No, it's a welded ring. I know the company Spro makes it, and the reason we like that.
Solid ring.
Yeah, Spro actually welds theirs. The solid ones that we have found on the market, they're not a perfect, I guess, a round wire. So it's not to say that that's going to present a problem, but we've just started to really get ourselves in tune with that Spro, whatever the power welded ring, something
Right.
like
So
that.
for slow pitch, and I agree exactly what he said for speed jigging. For speed jigging, I would only use a solid ring as my terminal off of my main line, right? But for slow jigging, personally, I prefer to have a barrel swivel that's on there. I think a lot of times we're fishing for bottom fish. You know, I know this is tuna specific, but for bottom fish, rockfish, things like that, the larger fish are going to usually have their mouths open and they're going to spin on the way up. What I found is that barrel swivel on there doesn't impede the action of the jig, because I'm not necessarily ripping that jig through the water. I'm letting it do what it does on the fall. But as that fish comes up, it stops my line twist as I'm coming up. And some folks will say, oh, it's braided line, it's twisted already, and that's all well and good until you go cast the next time and you get a wind knot and you don't know why you got the wind knot in there. So I think it's the difference between speed and slow.
All right.
Actually, can I make one last point?
Yeah, please, yeah.
One last point on the selection of the actual solid ring or the swivel that you're using. You always want to make sure that whatever metal connection is on there is at least half the diameter of your leader. Okay, and the reason why is because if it's any tighter than half the diameter, you're going to create a pinch point, and that's where you're going to have break-offs. So you want to make sure that you have enough diameter of metal on there that you're not creating a pinch point on that metal. That's the weakest link between your leader to your jig.
Excellent. Anybody else? Yes. A little louder, sorry. I don't think any of this has anything to do with trolling, so this is all vertical jigging. So none of this is trolling. So, guys, I want to give these guys a big round of applause. They did a great job. I want to get them back to the booth. Guys, make sure you get to CCA. If you guys haven't got your membership, please do. Remember, this affects all of us. And enjoy the show, guys. Thanks for coming.